welcome to the panelists. We're excited to have you here. This is our first cXc Europe webinar, and we've got our regional collaborator here from Report from the World, Preeti Nalu. So she's the executive director from Report from the World, and we've also got two other brilliant panelists, Elise Mizon, a media activist and strategy lead at the Bristol Cable, and Katerina Sarfati, the Managing Director for Inclusion and the Global Lead at C40. So they will be obviously giving you a little bit more information about themselves and about this subject as well. So before we begin on the actual the subject itself, just wanted to share a little bit about climate exchange and who we are and how it came to be. So Climate Exchange is part of Suli. Suli is a community interest company. It's pronounced Suli. It's a Finnish word, and it means a measure of depth or an embrace. Suli's founders, there are two founders, Tom Trinard and Fergus Bell. They set it up as a response to their observation that climate journalism perhaps isn't going as far as it could in reporting the impact of climate change with speed, with urgency, and with optimism at scale to make a meaningful change in our ecosystem. And one of the things we just wanted to highlight that is actually the optimism piece of this. So a lot of the reporting that is around climate journalism at the moment is kind of fear and negativity around the subject. And so we wanted to look and see if we could start to change the ecosystem and the media ecosystem to look at how collaborations and changing that dialogue could actually start to increase the knowledge, the interest, and the relevancy of climate in the world. And so the first of Suli's initiatives was born, which is Climate Exchange. Our vision is that everyone has access to equitable, trustworthy, and accurate information. We look to catalyze this fundamental shift in climate-related journalism. So we envisioned that this transformation prioritizes locally relevant content and looks at how the tangible causes of climate change can actually transition us to a more sustainable, carbon-conscious way of living. We're on a big, good, great mission with our partners and our collaborators, and it really is a collective mission to create a difference by making climate content a cultural currency. And what we mean by sort of a cultural currency and why culture is because culture is all-encompassing. So it's the fabric, the very fabric of our lives. And that's why this subject of today of climate diplomacy and journalism is so important in terms of a dialogue. We're really trying to look to build a groundswell for how diplomacy and climate can stabilize it, how we can look at global cooperation and good relationships between both government and non-state actors and influencers to be a critical part of this story, and how people at large and these institutions can be impacted by stories and accurate, relevant journalism. And the same goes for the just transition. So how journalists, culture creators, and storytellers can play an essential role in this transition. So we look at the whole spectrum from human rights, community, accessibility, and how citizens and external parties can be part of that narrative and hopefully play a role in the design of local and global policy, and looking at the democratic development of these and how the narrative can be put into culture in a slightly different way. As I mentioned before, we are really around collaboration, and that's how we want to empower people's development of content and how climate content can really push the limits of legacy media. So by forming new media ecosystems, we look to different partners, so we across the board, which is why we've got this great spectrum of speakers here today. And why we've also got regional collaborators. So we've got, as I mentioned, Report for the World in Europe. We have WINIFRA in Southeast Asia and WITS in Africa. And this partner approach really is important to us to look at a spectrum of skills from academia, business, community, government, and planetary representatives to get a really rounded story and increase the relevancy of that. So how we do that is we're a free membership platform, and we're built on 3 very clear pillars that hopefully address these ecosystem challenges. The first pillar is the content exchange, which is a reciprocal distribution hub where partners put in content, and the content is exchanged across countries, cross regions, cross publications, and it's really built on reciprocity. The second pillar is the knowledge exchange, which looks at sustainable financial models and really pushes opportunities for organizations to look at this in a slightly different way, not potentially obligated by traditional ways of looking at things, but sort of thinking outside the box with thought leaders and industry game changers. And then from a regional exchange, it's how we work with our regional partners to really start to put that information out there into the ether and leverage the regional collaborations that we have. So with collaboration, togetherness, and reciprocity, that's how we're trying to look at a new change of climate reporting, and why this subject is so close to our hearts about this intersection of climate diplomacy and journalism. Today's lens specifically being in the European context. So before we hand the floor over to our first speaker, Preeti, just wanted to do a quick poll. I think the poll is coming. It's going to be served up now. And it's really around COP28. Not sure about everyone's opinions of COP28, but from the outputs of it, please vote on what you find most promising in addressing the challenges of a just transition, alternative energy, commitment to loss and damage, commitment to reduction of methane, addressing nature and planetary boundaries, or the development of climate tech. So while people are polling away, it looks like there might be a clear winner. I'm going to hand the floor or the screen over to Preeti.
Well, thank you for the introduction about climate exchange. We're really excited to launch a Europe-focused climate exchange with Suli, and to participate in this launch webinar. What I would like to do today is widen the view a bit to present global perspectives on how local media across the globe are covering climate, and how interlocutors and facilitators like us can strengthen, connect, and amplify their efforts. So I should start by introducing Report for the World as a program. So we define ourselves as a global journalism service program. Service being the operative word here, that supports full-time journalists working on critical issues such as climate change, environment, energy, governance, corruption, education, health, and others at public interest media across the world. We're currently working with 32 newsroom partners and 45 reporters employed by them as staff in 20 countries. And we're poised to expand to over 65 reporters and I believe 25 plus countries by spring. And we'll be announcing a Europe-specific call for applications very soon. And so a core part of our mission is to help our newsroom partners develop and sustain deeper, more viable reporting practices. So this would mean that we provide a combination of technical and cross-border collaborations for our reporters, and audience engagement and revenue diversification for our newsrooms. So our goal is to leave local news media landscapes more sustainable than when we enter them. So given that climate is our most popular beat, we have reporters from Ukraine to India to Brazil to Nigeria. We've been working with our partners to create more engaging, persuasive, constructive, investigative methods of reporting on this topic. Now, of course, the tricky part is creating enough concern and a combination of individual and collective responsibility among, or a sense of collective responsibility among our audiences, but without a level of alarm that leads to news avoidance. Simple, right? And since this is not an exact science, we have started to measure impact through case studies that our newsrooms present us with. So we see our local media partners playing an extremely important role in providing actionable solutions to global issues like climate change that have very specific local repercussions. And we see that our local newsrooms are actually bringing in concrete impact and value through beat-focused reporting and with intersectional themes. So let me quickly go over some of these impact areas that we try to measure and further facilitate. So first, we see that our local media create greater civic engagement and positive action within their communities. So at a local level, as a reporter or as a citizen, you actually have a chance to engage, influence, and make a difference. So the beats, so this bears a larger collective implication for global events related to climate change. And this is what our newsrooms report time and again over the past, I would say, 3 years, but also at our sister program, Report for America, the details of which I would like to share in just a little bit. So when residents feel that they can, or audiences feel that they can trigger positive changes in their neighborhoods, we see that they actively participate in demanding reforms. And so, especially in the global South, in doing so, they strengthen local democracies. Of course, this can very well apply to a European context, which is very diverse. Second, we see that our journalists cover their communities with greater representation and context. This is through languages, through specialized knowledge about their communities, through consistency, through proximity, and of course, access to diverse interviews. Third, we see local beat reporting enables journalists to foster direct accountability. So we see our reporters actually being able to hold local officials accountable in their actions and initiating positive changes or remedies. An example that comes to mind is our newsroom, Marco Zero, in Brazil. It was after they covered the impact of a wind farm project in Rio Grande that the governor, who had previously not engaged in dialogue with activists, created a working group with representatives from that very local community. Now, fourth, we see media platforms covering specific communities are able to make cross-border links and work collaboratively. And our goal here is to foster such collaborations, not just within countries, but as Shireen mentioned, across continents and across wide geographies. So we hope that through this climate exchange, the European outlets will gradually make contact and work together and share content with those in Southeast Asia and in parts of Africa. Fifth, we see that local media are more effectively able to fight disinformation and stereotypes. Again, of course, through context, nuance, language, and proximity. Sixth, a very important one that we learned from our sister program is that local beat reporting actually helps create trust within communities and audiences. So our team has been fortunate enough to learn from years of experience in the United States, where Report for America has already placed 600 reporters in all of the states of the US since 2017. And surveys in the US have shown that nearly 60% of those who cover audiences who follow local news had a strong sense of community, compared to only 27% among those who did not follow local news. On the other hand, we also found that the decline of local reporting has shown greater polarization and misinformation. And finally, and this will bring me to the presentation part, we see that local media helps galvanize communities at different levels. To illustrate this point, I'm reminded of a leading phrase from Sawadin, our South African newsroom partner, that says, "We know our place in our communities, but also at the head of the table." So in line with this, Suwatan has been maintaining strong community-focused beats, and we're supporting a migration climate change beat in that newsroom. And they're able to link movements and help galvanize engaged communities across the country. So what we're seeing is that such media are well placed to connect the trends across borders and sectors, and to create audiences and accountability at different levels. And this is where we find our long-term transformational value, if you will, in connecting these efforts across geographies and scaling and systemizing their efforts. I think I'm safe enough to end this poll, right? Or share results, it says. So I'll do that. And let's see. All right, so now this mapping, the second slide here, the first slide shows where we are in the world, and happy to share the contact information of the team separately, or maybe one of the team members is here and can do that kindly. And so here's our initial mapping. So this mapping shows basically the general lay of how we collaborate with key regional partners like SULI in Europe and others in Latin America, Asia, Africa, MENA, and North America to basically form virtual and I suppose on the ground in-person networks. Our goal is to amplify the existing efforts of different sized media in creating communities, accountability, and sustainability around climate reporting and other beat-focused reporting. And the larger objective is to forge these local global connections in journalism. So I'll start quickly with engagement and try to use a few case studies from our newsrooms as examples. We see that many of our media partners are reaching targeted audiences successfully, and then in turn activating larger general audiences. For example, in Ukraine, our journalist Dmytro Simonov at Ukrainska Pravda revealed how Russian forces nearly emptied the largest water tank in Ukraine, nearly depleting a nuclear plant nearby and close by, and that led to a near explosion. And he was the first to report this story, and this was used as evidence of deliberate Russian actions in the war that would equate to war crimes. And at the same time, it also reached large audiences inside Ukraine through YouTube and through the website. Their Russian counterpart, iStories, has also been documenting war crimes by Russian forces that are along the same lines, and they're being used by the International Criminal Court while reaching millions of Russian audiences through YouTube. Now, the second part where we play a role is collaborations. One type of collaboration is a cross-border editorial project that explores global consequences of local stories. For example, our reporting team at Info Amazonia received guidance from OCCRP's Europe team and worked with Mongabe to look at how the carbon credit market in Europe is violating the rights of indigenous communities. Now, there are also collaborations going on among our media within countries and across certain regions. In India, for example, where media freedoms are quickly regressing, we have our Indian partners, The Scroll, The Wire, The News Minute. They've formed a national coalition that is together covering not just news reports on the elections, but also deeper critical beats like climate change. We're also, of course, seeing more of this happen in a European context, not necessarily because of regressing laws, but we are seeing European media of different sizes working together across borders and different languages on climate reporting. The third part is professional development. We're seeing that a lot of our local media are doing some groundbreaking work by nurturing new generations of journalists. So we help them with professional development activities. For example, our partner in Pakistan, the Tribal News Network, has been training women journalists in some of the most remote parts of the country and from migrant and displaced communities that are acutely impacted by floods and changing weather patterns. We also have networks of between European media and local media in the global south. One great example is the fantastic work the Lighthouse Reports is doing in working with and training reporters at several media in exile, including our partners in Afghanistan and Syria, on different methods of investigative reporting, from open source investigative methods to training them on tracking money trails across continents. And so these are three of our main efforts as interlocutors or as facilitators of these networks. And what we're seeing is into our third year, as we support these three areas, we're starting to see that our new local newsrooms have multi-level audiences, they have more story visibility, and their local media landscapes are being strengthened. Now, out of this mapping, this is how we came to work with Suli, is that we started to, or rather, this is one of the reasons why this collaboration came about, is that we need, or we are grateful to have the expertise of an organization like Suli, because it allows us to look at how to create greater story impact on beat-focused and mission-driven journalism, and to look at how audience engagement can come about from that story impact, and then to look at the overlap between the two to see how we can transform that story impact into membership and revenue. So this is the part I think Shireen is much better placed to explain, and the rest of the team. So I just wanted to sort of open this up as, you know, the basic premise, but this also obviously applies to the conversation that we're talking about, because it is local media that are covering specific communities in a European context that are best placed to map out how a just transition should take place in different communities, what are the levels and different types of vulnerabilities, what are the public and private initiatives that exist, how well they're functioning, the accountability mechanisms in place, and their progress towards the 2023 target. So naturally, mapping these mapping this out at a specific regional or community or level is much easier than at a national or an international level, because following up on these issues is easier for full-time staff that actually have proximity to these communities. And so I suppose this is a key premise of the climate exchange, is to create these types of communities that interact with each other at community, regional, national, and international levels to be able to more effectively cover climate change. So I know I've spoken at length, and there'll be probably follow-up questions. So Shireen, back to you.
Thank you, Preeti. I don't know if anyone has any questions. If you do, please pop them into the Q&A, and we will seek to address them. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think one of the questions that we wanted to just sort of look into a little bit more is in terms of looking at the concerns of vulnerable communities locally. How do you see that the sort of the combination of policy makers and journalists intersect in these? Do you see that there is a collaborative will or want in terms of working together towards an agenda of a just transition, or are there still somewhat divides that you're seeing in terms of more vulnerable communities?
I think increasingly, at least at a global level, and I'm seeing this in a much more sort of concerted, happening in a much more concerted manner in Europe, is cross-sectoral collaboration. And this is helping a lot of news media reach more audiences, because according to a recent global study by Reuters Institute, and this looked at 8 countries in the global south and north, where it was reported that scientists and climate activists and advocates were deemed the most reliable sources for audiences looking for credible climate change information. So in this case, these experts are not just disseminators, or they're not just conveyors of all sources of information, they also disseminate them. So I think we're seeing greater collaboration across sectors because of this reason, because the audiences are different, right? So let me sort of think about the other types of collaboration, which is cross-border, cross-thematic, and cross-scale, right? This is also happening among media outlets because it is the most direct way by which media can also work between themselves and to be able to share resources and to reach audiences that speak different languages, that are situated in different geographies. So we are starting to see more partnerships take place.
Yeah, so I hope that's hopefully very optimistic in terms of the policy developments as well. You mentioned before that you work with the needs of young people in some of these areas, and in terms of collaborating with them. Do you see that there's a need for either young journalists or young writers, young content creators, youth in general, to have access and understanding to what sort of just transition is, and to be given skills to be prepared to deal with this? Do you think that is something of growing importance, things that are being addressed at the moment, or still needs to be addressed in some way by sort of more established journalists, reporters, content creators?
Well, I mean, we are nurturing new generations of journalism. So some of our reporters are early career, which means that their experience would be under 3 years. And then we have mid-career journalists. So we're also, and this applies to our newsrooms too. So we have some newsrooms that have been around for more than a decade and others that are much younger. So what we're trying to do is actually create sort of peer-to-peer networks among them. So instead of saying you should, sort of learn this sort of a skill, or this is what you're missing, our training sessions and workshops allow them to shape their stories actively. So they bring their story ideas or deeper reporting pitches to these workshops, and they work as groups. So sometimes you see more mature, or when I say mature in terms of growth, newsrooms working with newer ones and exchanging sort of knowledge on best practices, but also new approaches to storytelling, or how to integrate impact into the very early stages of planning. So again, our role there is much being a facilitator, but also providing the technical trainings and, where possible, additional resources so that they may achieve deeper reporting focused on climate change.
Okay, wonderful. I see the common theme of collaboration coming through perpetually. Thank you very much, Preeti. We're going to pass the floor screen over to Elise Mizon now from Bristol Cable, so media activist and strategy lead. Thank you for being here. Please, the floor is yours.
So I'm Elise Mizon. I'm from the Cable. I joined in 2022 as the communications lead, and more recently I've become the strategy lead, which means I'm trying to make the organisation much more sustainable and efficient, and thinking about a lot of different things, such as what are we going to do in 5 years and how do we make money and things like that. So it's all very nerdy, but I really enjoy it. But before I was working at the Cable, I was a media writer. I suppose I still am, technically. So I write about the media, and among a couple of different things, mostly I write about sort of press ethics. And one of the things that I've specialised in is how the media covers climate change, or doesn't, as the case may be. So that's a little bit of background on kind of what I do. And now I'm working at the Cable, which is a local newspaper and website. We are a reader-owned cooperative media outlet based in the city of Bristol in the UK. Bristol's got 500,000 people-ish population, about 375,000 adults, I think. And we're trying to pioneer a new model for how local news should be owned, produced and funded. So we're directly funded and owned by just over 2,500 members in the city, who contribute almost half of our income. We publish in-depth local journalism, things like investigations and solutions journalism, as well as community voice pieces. And we frequently engage our audience in our work. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a minute. But in terms of the kind of format, we publish regularly online. We have a weekly newsletter, we do podcasts and video, and we also have this quarterly flagship print edition, and we publish up to 30,000 copies every quarter, so 4 times a year. And we distribute those across the city. As you can see on the front page there, it says made free by members. So the paper is free to pick up wherever you find one, and you can take it home and that copy is yours. But it is made free by the people that subscribe to us, and everybody who subscribes gets a paper sent to their door as long as they pay £5 a month or more. So that's how it's funded. We also get some grant funding. So in terms of how you could sort of describe the cable, if you like, it is investigative, independent journalism, slow news, community journalism. There's lots of different ways to describe it, but ultimately we're focused on in-depth stories that benefit the wider population of Bristol, in collaboration with the people of Bristol. And all of our journalism is ethically produced as much as possible, and we avoid sensationalism. So though we report on a huge number of things, as a coastal city, climate is a priority for us, of course. Next slide, please. Another thing to say as well as just being a coastal city, is that cities, and obviously so local journalism that focuses on the future of cities, are going to play a huge role in upcoming climate diplomacy. I think by 2050, I can't remember what the stat is now. It would be really useful if I could remember this, but it's about 50% of us, I think, or maybe even 2/3 of the population will live in cities, is the kind of prediction. So cities are going to play a huge role in climate diplomacy. And this was the focus of our solutions journalism project last year, the Future of Cities, which we ran throughout 2023. And a group of news organisations, some of them local, some of them national, were given a grant to essentially pioneer solutions journalism across Europe. And we used our grant to look at solutions that had been found in other cities, a lot of which was to do with resources and climate, and how they could or couldn't be applied to Bristol. So this is a few of the kind of images, a few of the different articles that we wrote for the Future of Cities. And if you want to read any more of those stories or see any more about the project, you can go to bristolcable.org/future cities, which is in the top right-hand corner there. I really would encourage anybody who's interested in local journalism about climate to have a little look at that. And I'll go into a few more details of stories that the cable has done outside of that project in a minute. So really, you know, we were obviously focused on doing journalism about solutions, particularly to environmental issues, but we were also really focused on actually having impact with that journalism, and that is a feature of pretty much all of our journalism. We try and make sure that when we're doing big investigations and we're talking about things that need to be fixed or problems that need to be solved, we are trying to make sure those things, those articles, sorry, get in front of the right people. And we were praised by the recipients, the councillors, local MPs, for kind of bullet pointing all of our articles that we sent to them. I mean, as you know, as most people are, anyone with any kind of governmental power is very busy. And so we had one councillor say that because we had made all of our reporting so accessible, we'd sent it directly to them and we'd bullet pointed all the top findings that they would be using our reporting in an upcoming commission they were doing on rent controls. So that was a really clear kind of point of impact. So for any other journalists or even, let's say, strategy leads out there who are listening, that is something that we have found is really welcomed. Is, you know, we know what the headlines of our stories are, and if we can make those really accessible for the people that we want to listen, so much the better. Next slide, please. So we really take a holistic approach to our journalism. And climate is a place where, of course, the benefits of this show up hugely. So our journalists do have specialisms, and they function in some senses as generalists some of the time when they need to. They're able to link topics together based on previous reporting that they've done. But as this Guardian article from the weekend shows, the climate emergency is something that really needs to be addressed holistically, of course. It's not simply a case of reducing emissions. We also need to decrease demand and do a lot of kind of rethinking, re-strategizing the way that the world works. And what we can do in the media is contextualize what those issues are, how they intersect, where they intersect, and what the possibilities are. So there's a lot of shifting thinking and shifting priorities, and opening up possibilities, I think, is a really huge part of this. Another thing that the media can do, if we can go, sorry, to the next slide again, is, you know, storytelling is incredibly important in influencing processes of action and achieving justice by kind of linking into people's emotions. So achieving justice more often than not requires long-term fighting. Any kind of just transition is going to be something that there is some resistance to, because it's a huge job and people don't see how things can be changed. and the strength of emotion needed to sustain that fight can be really captured in well-crafted human stories. I don't know if anybody is following this example in the UK right now, but a few years ago, the post office Horizon scandal came up, which was our post office was using faulty software, and instead of blaming that faulty software, which they had been spending a lot of money on, they decided to blame the people that owned individual post offices, and some of those people went to prison. Some of those people lost their lives before their names were cleared. And you know, it was a big scandal when it first came up a few years ago. But it's seen a huge amount of renewed interest and new claimants coming forwards, public pressure for the government to intervene after an ITV drama, which has come just in a couple of weeks ago. And so this kind of showing, you know, human stories. I mean, of course, this is a narrative drama, but it is based on real life events. And I think journalism, when done well, particularly when done through multimedia, can very much do the same thing. So this capturing of people's emotions and opening up possibilities of what can and should happen is really, I think, a huge part of any kind of just transition. You've got to win some hearts and minds. Next slide, please. So all of our reporting is linked as much as possible to impact activities. Like I said, we're really focused on engaging decision makers and kind of, I wouldn't call it lobbying necessarily, because I don't think it's, you know, we're not sort of paying people to go and meet with the council or anything like that, but we will highlight our the work that we've done and the suggestions and solutions journalism particularly that we've done, and present that to who we think are the decision makers, the policy makers in that field. And it's really useful to identify specific places that intervention can be made. So it's all well and good saying, you know, we want this utopian idea to happen, but if there isn't actually a sort of point of entry or a possibility that that's going to happen, people will just dismiss it. So really trying to identify the opportunities and the possibilities, I think, is something that journalists can do. And when you're a local media outlet, that's a lot easier, because you're dealing with a smaller geographical area or a smaller number of people, or one local council, rather than a national network of local councils as well as a national government. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to, I'm not sure what's happened to the text there, but hopefully you can read that. I'm just going to go through a few sort of formats and ways that we format our journalism so as to try and influence public debate and influence policy making and diplomacy, you might call it that. So solutions journalism, as I said, this is one of the front cover stories when we did our Future of Cities project, which was about a small scale microgrid scheme in a local neighbourhood, which was helping a group of Bristol homeowners to take power into their own hands. And the question was, can we supercharge community energy projects to benefit everyone? Or was this, just for this one small neighbourhood? Next slide, please. We also do watchdog journalism. So we look at, the council has said that they've got all these climate pledges and they want to get to net zero by 2030 and all this kind of stuff. So we will do a check-in of, okay, so how are we doing on that? How are we doing on transport? How are we doing on emissions? Being a watchdog, continuously holding decision makers to account is also something that we do a lot of. And next slide, please. We also do comment journalism, but we don't do comment journalism in the way that a lot of nationals do it, where they essentially just get somebody who's very controversial to say what they reckon. We ask people who are experts. So this is a local academic, for example, who works on public health, and he's written something about the cities of the future and how public health needs to be prioritised if we're, going to live a nice life. And he knows about that stuff because that is his area of research. So we do comment journalism, but we do it with local people who are experts in the subject. And obviously that is incredibly important for accuracy. And finally, next slide, please. We also do community journalism. That's what the Bristol Cable is really all about. So in terms of, having a just transition, I don't think that you can have that unless you include the people who are most affected. And so quite a lot of the time, the people who are most affected are either being interviewed by our journalists or they're writing stuff for the cable themselves. And we really, really centre our journalism around the people who live in Bristol, and really trying to get, a good cross-section of the different types of people from different backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, economic backgrounds, making sure that, the people are speaking on the issues that are in the paper are the people who are affected most by those issues, as well as decision makers and experts and academics and that sort of thing. So that's a little overview of the Bristol Cable and how we choose stories and run stories about climate, and hopefully gives a sense of how we try and make sure that we're contributing as much as we can to a just transition in lots of different areas, but particularly with climate. So happy to take any questions, and thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for that. It's brilliant. It's one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, we often have a lot of conversation at cXc about relevancy, and how do we actually make climate more relevant to audiences at large. So a lot of the the understanding around, okay, you have a story and you have the hook, but how do we actually start to tell that story in an engaging and a relevant way, so people can actually sort of understand how to either act, how to disseminate knowledge further. How do you source some of those stories? I know you gave examples of the community element, but do you find there's sort of certain insights that you have of what audience and readers want, or do you do audience research? What's your sort of secret sauce, if you would give some away?
Sure. So I think that there is an element of lots of different things. So for example, people will pitch stuff to us, as well as us kind of going out to find stories. But one of the things we do is, because we're a co-op, we're a reader-owned co-op, we have an AGM, an annual general meeting every single year. And our members, or owners, sometimes we call them member owners, basically give us a steer on what they want us to write about. And we also are launching a new project this year where we will have community newsrooms. Okay. Where we will actually go into specific neighborhoods and say, right, what stories are not being told in your area? What is it that you guys want us to write about? How do you want us to write about it? Do you want us to write it as journalists, being very sort of nerdy and doing all of this research, talking to lots of people and then bringing it together? Or do you think this is a community voices piece where one of you might like to, if any of you are particularly good writers, you could write that and we will publish it in the paper. So we have lots of different methods of getting sourcing stories and making sure that comes from a kind of collaboration with our member owners. We also do frequent surveys. So we have a membership system which not only tracks all of the people who are members of the cable and keeps their address so that we can send them the paper and stuff, but it also allows us to create a survey and then send it to all of those people. And we can also make it public, so it could be our members and our readers who don't pay for the cable but still read the cable frequently. So we have all of these kind of feedback mechanisms which allow people to interact with our journalism, and we really have pioneered that model and we're really proud of it. So it does mean that people are really focused in on being able to give us feedback and be involved in our journalism. So that's one way. And then your sort of slightly other part of your question about format is, we do have to decide every time we do a story, is this best as a podcast? Is this a long read investigation which is written? Is this a data story and it should be done as a data viz? So it really is just like, what's the makeup of the story? How are we going to engage people in this information? If it's a bunch of sort of stats and numbers, we're not going to write a sort of long text piece about it. We're going to do it as a data visualization with graphs, or some other kind of really good graphic design. Really good graphic design. You can tell I'm not a designer. I'm definitely a strategy person. I don't even have the language to talk about it, but we make it as accessible as possible. Sometimes something's just definitely going to work best as a video, so we do it as a video. So that my answer to your question is really, it's lots of different things.
And just in terms of, we're going to do a poll shortly around impact, so I'm going to pitch it to you first, though. How do you capture the impact of the stories, so both from a short-term perspective, but also from a longer term? So in terms of even sort of the change, then potentially the impact on policy, and how that actually starts to manifest itself in terms of changes you see in the community.
It's really hard. I mean, it's notoriously hard, as I'm sure you know, and probably everyone on the call knows, it's really hard to measure impact, because you don't know how many people are always reading you, especially if you're not, It doesn't have a paywall, so we can be read by as many people as, can access our website. So we don't know how many people are reading us always. We've got some idea of numbers from our, analytics software that we have, and our circulation, but we don't know how many people are reading us. And when you are writing about things, usually it will take, if you want to make a change in policy, for example, that's almost always going to take a very long time. So you might write about something and then 2 years later, a policy, changes, and it's never going to be entirely because of one article that you wrote, but, so what we try and do is, we try and measure these things as much as possible and as much as is sensible, as much as we have the capacity to track it. So, for example, anytime, in the UK, obviously, we have Hansard. So whenever we're mentioned in Parliament, that is recorded, and we keep a kind of record of our impact. Whenever we are cited by the council, usually somebody will tell us that, the council said today that, your article influenced something that they've done. But more often than not, if that's the case, it will be because we've sent it to them and they'll say, okay, we're going to use this in this policy document that we're writing or report that we're writing or whatever. So we track all of those times that people tell us, your article or your research has influenced X thing. But we also do some impact surveys of our audience again. So, for example, if we've written a story and we want people to have acted on it, we've got a specific call to action in that story. Quite a lot of the time, we'll then do a survey, did this article make you act? Did it make you want to act, but you kind of didn't really do it in the end? Whatever we need to ask them. And again, that's not an exact science because everybody who read the article didn't necessarily also do the survey. But there's an element of trying to be very kind of patient with impact because it's so difficult to actually get any concrete data. But yeah, I that's kind of what we are doing at the moment, and we're still really building our impact processes. So any advice is very welcome.
Thank you so much for that. So we're going to serve up another poll, which is exactly around that. So it's asking people on the call about how they capture the impact of storytelling. Is it around audience engagement and reach metrics like the clicks and the shares, which is more of the shorter term piece, focus groups or forums, surveys, polls, monitoring shifts in policy, which, as you mentioned, is much more difficult, or just none of the above because it's complicated and there's help that's needed in this. So while that poll is being served up, thank you so much for that. It was really, really great and informative. So thank you. And we're going to hand the floor screen over to Kate. Kate is from C40 and she'll do a lovely intro. And thank you, Kate. Welcome.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you for having me in this very, very interesting panel discussion and webinar. I'm managing director in an organization called C40. It's a network of the largest cities in the world. So we work directly with mayors of the biggest cities of the world at the front line of tackling the climate crisis. And we support them in delivering action at the local level that is meaningful from a climate perspective. And then we use their voice to influence national policies, international policies, and international platforms through the work that they're doing locally. So my caveat and premise is that I'm not a comms person, I'm not a media person, I don't have any background in media, but it's for the last 15 years, I've been working with media and with the communication world by supporting politicians. That's what I work. Our key stakeholders have been sort of politicians, and our politicians at the local level and institutional level. And then we work, of course, with very different partners. So I'm going to share my screen. And again, I hope it's an interesting perspective, but apologies from the start for any sort of naive language or external perspective that you might have from me today. So let me see if this go. Okay. So, you know, working with cities of the world, you know, from Shanghai to Cape Town to New York, it's very clear, as it is for everybody in this panel and in this webinar, that the climate crisis is happening today. 98% of our cities have already experienced some sort of impact or issues related to the climate crisis that they are presently dealing with. But we often see still that it's not always depicted like this and talked about like this. It's still sort of talked about like something of the future and something that will sort of deal with that will impact the next generations, our children, our nephews, and not something that is at present. And of course, you know, I'm not talking about The Guardian. Unfortunately, the world is not The Guardian, unfortunately. And I might also be biased by having strong sort of, by reading Italian news and Italian newspaper, as I'm based in Italy. But, you know, these are 3 examples only in Italy last year. And what sort of severe climate impact that happened last year in Italy and in the region of Italy, in the south of Europe. And, you know, there's still sort of lots of time stories around sort of crazy weather, unforeseen weather versus actually telling a story around the climate crisis and linking the impact on people with the climate crisis. And then, as you can see from these pictures and how it has been covered, there's lots of infrastructure, there's lots of numbers, there's not a lot of people. And so, you know, there's a lot of discussion around the need to save the planet, the fact that the climate crisis will have an impact on our planet. Our planet will be here. It's the human race that is in danger. And often there is a lack of awareness and understanding in the narratives and the stories around the fact that it's actually people and most often the least well-off of people that are impacted by the climate crisis. So that's definitely a gap that we see and that our mayors sort of face when deciding to engage on the climate crisis, because ultimately when politicians need to engage in the climate crisis, they need to show what the benefit is for their voters and for the people that live in their cities. And so having a sort of stronger narrative on the impact on people, of course, is conducive of better policies for people. Not only the climate crisis is happening today, but we're seeing that disinformation is happening today and is increasing a lot on climate change. My experience working with local politicians is that the same, if not more and stronger wave of disinformation and fake news that immigration experienced before the pandemic in Europe and in the northern world, now it's being experienced by climate. And the kind of polarization and disinformation, misinformation, fake news on climate are even sort of worse or more or stronger than what happened to immigration a few years ago. And I think we will see this a lot in the European elections in the next few months. And we're seeing this also at local level, not just at global level, not just at regional level, but for example, we've been working with our chair, the Mayor of London, on the biggest low emission area being delivered in a city globally by Mayor Sadiq Khan. It seemed that there was a lot of opposition to the measure because of sort of concerns around equity, around the impact on people. But actually, when we digged into it, we saw that a lot of the disinformation and opposition on the measure came from bots and from paid social media fake profiles. So there's quite a lot in terms of debunking myths, fighting disinformation and fighting fake news that, of course, is beneficial for good policy on climate, but is also a key duty for sort of the communications and media space. Third point, I would say that, of course, you know, scientific knowledge and scientific information is key, and the ability to talk about scientific information and supporting scientific information is key in the climate space. But with the additional challenge that we know that science is right and was right on the most fundamental and comfortable truth that the climate crisis is happening and is produced by human activity, but the science wasn't always right. Scenarios and provisions and forecasts have been historically more optimistic than what actually had happened. This is an example that we often give. When I started as a student working on climate displacement and climate migration, the provisions from the World Bank talked about 80 million people forced to move by 2050 if emissions didn't fall. So it was 80 million over the course of 40 years all over the world. In Pakistan 2 years ago, because of the climate crisis and some of the flooding in that area, we saw 30 million people internally displaced in one country in just 1 year. As a testament of how some of sort of the data and the numbers that have been there for a while have been much more optimistic than what actually has happened. So the challenge here is backing science and communicating scientifically, but acknowledging that climate science is not a perfect science, and tipping points and new scenarios are always on the verge of happening. And then following through, we've talked about climate migration. Another sort of element of the climate crisis that is very real in cities, and it's very real for political leaders we work with, but is often an untold story, is the climate crisis as a history of inequality, not just an environmental history, not just an economical history, but a social, economical, and environmental history of inequality. The narrative that we see often is inequality of impacts. We know, and we've been reading a lot about the inequality of impacts of the climate crisis. In our cities, the most impacted are the poorest, women are impacted more than men. People living in peripheries and difficult districts and low-income districts are more impacted than the richer people. Youth is more impacted, and that's a story that is gradually sort of rising. The real untold story that we are already seeing in our cities is that there's also an inequality in who is creating the climate crisis and who is driving the climate crisis. So inequality of emission production. Not just, for example, youth generations will have less possibility to consume and emit, but will be more impacted by the climate crisis. But also there is a clear responsibility of the most wealthier part of the population in driving the climate crisis. Not only 10% of the wealthiest contribute to half of global emissions, but even more startling, a report that I haven't seen a lot in media and communications when it came out a year ago or 2 years ago. When we look at per capita emissions rising, we see that yes, they have increased 2% since 1990. But when we look at who has increased them, 1% of the population increased per capita emissions of 30% since 1990, and 0.01% of the population, it's a bunch of billionaires, have increased per capita emissions of 80% since 1990, while middle class, working class, have reduced emissions by 15 or 20%. So there is inequality of responsibility of the climate crisis, not just between the global north and the global south, which is a very told story, but also among countries and among cities. And this has an impact on, it's not just sort of an important story to tell, but it has an impact on then how we build support for climate policies and for the climate transition, and how we develop policies that have support for the climate, for climate. And then this relates also to the injustices of fossil fuels, of fossil fuel production. There is, of course, on one hand, we know, and after COP28, this has been even more clear, that fossil fuels are the major responsible and culprits of the climate crisis. But the issues around fossil fuel production, extraction, and consumption is not only related to climate, but is also related to social economical impacts in terms of the huge amount of money, of public money, going to subsidize fossil fuels instead of going to poverty reduction, education, social care, healthcare. It's the amount of profits that are created by these subsidies and this public money that are not shared benefits and are not shared profits and don't create shared wealth. and then the sort of health impacts of fossil fuel production and consumption in cities. And these and sort of the angle of injustices of fossil fuels and the angle of injustices of emission and consumption production is a critical part of the story, that sometimes we find it sort of buried and more untold, and it's crucial to sort of build support for climate action. Because ultimately, this is a sort of quote from an Italian philosopher and journalist, which I thought it was nice to sort of bring to this platform, of, I think now it's sort of 20, maybe 30 years ago, one of the first people that stated, in order to be effective and in order to establish itself, the ecological conversion and therefore the green transition has to be socially desirable. We have to build a social license for climate action to be supported, understood, and therefore delivered. And sort of building the social license of climate action is responsibility first and foremost of politicians and policymakers, but also of the wider community and definitely of the media and communications community. And also because good examples of just transition, good examples of fair transition. I know I was very, very much in agreement on what Ellis was saying. I could have said sort of very similar things from a policy perspective. Solutions exist that actually bring together social justice, climate justice, just transition, and show what a fair, inclusive transition means in practice. And there is a big need of raising hope that it's just transition and fair transition is not just an abstract concept, but it's actually a reality that is already happening and that needs to be more supported and scaled. For example, from our perspective, we're working with cities all over the world that have very different challenges, that have very different contexts, but are delivering a just transition. Jakarta has increased and doubled public support in the past few years by reducing costs on families, which is always a challenge and has happened in some cities. So families paid 30% of their income in public transport, having less access to it. Now they have more access to it and pay 10% of their income on it. And this is a crucial example of what a fair transition in cities are. Los Angeles, it's an oil city. They still have oil wells and oil infrastructure. They have put a ban on oil infrastructure, and they have done so with a task force, with unions, and a fund for affected workers to make sure that that kind of ban didn't affect the workers, or at least ensured that all workers had equitable access to green jobs. Because we know that the transition will bring green jobs, we know that climate will bring more jobs, but we don't know that these jobs will actually be accessible by those who need them the most. And we need to show what it means. And Warsaw's last example is a very challenging place because of the Ukraine war, because of big flows of immigration, conflict between national level and city level. They have been doing energy efficiency in cities, bypassing from coal stoves to heat pumps, so bypassing the need for gas. And they've been doing it in low-income housing and in social housing. So reducing energy poverty and delivering a just transition there where it was needed the most. And basically what these examples for me show is that on one hand, the climate transition and the green transition often is not a technological issue. We don't need to wait for like big technological innovation, but it's also about innovation of processes, innovation of governance, social innovation. This is not the kind of things that makes a headline. Changing a governance process inside a city is not the most sexiest story that you can think about, but it's crucial to make that kind of change and that kind of innovation. And on the other hand, what these examples say is that there is a healthy balance and a healthy in-between, depicting the climate transition or as a bloodshed with big job losses and big problems for economy, or depicting the climate transition as this new heaven of multiple benefits for everybody. It's more complex and it's more sophisticated than this, but telling this story while making the case for climate action, of course, is a challenge that we all have, but a very much needed challenge. So my key takeaways is that there is definitely a need for hope and that solutions are happening. We need to tell them more. There is a need for a more offensive narrative on the injustices of fossil fuel-led economies, and on the climate crisis as a history of inequality. It's not the age where complexity is particularly the cool kid on the block. Complexity is a hard sell, but it can be told through human stories, as Ellis was saying. Multidisciplinary and integrated efforts, skills and experiences are very much needed. There's climate journalism, but should we also think about how cultural journalism, economical journalism, daily journalism can be covered from a climate perspective? Can wars be covered from a climate perspective? Can cinema festivals be covered from a climate perspective? It's not just climate journalism, but it's like stories more broadly. All global issues can be told through a local lens so it's not just about talking about cities and local action, but it's talking about those big global issues from the perspective of locally led action. Data-driven and human-centered stories exist. And finally, is it the planet that we're trying to save or human race? And how can we be stronger in telling that story? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. It's really interesting stuff in there. We've only got about 5 minutes for Q&A. I actually wanted to just quickly throw up the last poll that we had to people, which is in relation to what Kate was talking about in terms of communities being heard and what policymakers should take on board. So we were thinking about how do you what in the ranking of importance, what do you think the following considerations are in terms of decision making for democratic decarbonisation and detoxification of cities? So if you go forth and rank those, that would be great. I just want to use the last final few minutes to open up some questions to the panel. There seems to be a reoccurring question that's coming in, which is really about accountability. So I'd just be interested in whoever wants to go first around how media can take on accountability and the role towards local decision makers with the transition as it stands. So where does accountability sit? And I suppose that can be from both policymakers and from communities and also journalists at large. So I don't know who would like to take that question. Maybe Katerina, do you want to see if you can, in terms of accountability, where does it lie, and how can the media take on some of that accountability?
Yeah, I think it's a fundamental question. I think what Ellis was saying earlier around being a watchdog is critical, in the sense that there is a huge amount of greenwashing out there. And greenwashing is normally thought as something that relates to businesses and the private sector, but of course it can be sort of applied to many different areas. There's policy and political leadership that do greenwashing, media that do greenwashing. There's quite a lot of greenwashing out there. So sort of having that kind of watchdog function, both from an investigative perspective and a media perspective, but also for those working at the policy level. And then ultimately every single resident and voter and citizen playing that kind of role is critical to make sure that then we're not only talking about commitments for the future but we're talking about daily action now, because even if the climate commitments are to 2030, 2050, this means taking action now in order to be able to deliver on them.
And Preeti, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quickly that what's great about the European context, or an advantage compared to the rest of the world, is there's some semblance of, although it's not perfectly functioning, concrete planning infrastructure and some level of transparency, in the sense that the member states are able to prepare their just transition plans that cover the period up to 2030, identifying the territories that need the most support, right? And these plans are required to address the social, economic, and environmental challenges. I'm sure they're not all, or not all of the plans are at the same level. So I think media, local media especially, they have this structure around which they can cover the different challenges. But of course, they need to work with the associated experts, from the scientists to the economists to urban planners, worker organizations, and businesses, to see how well these social, economic, and environmental aspects of a just transition are working. I think it's a little bit more challenging across the world where those kind of standards or expectations do not exist, at least not in such a concrete level.
Elise, do you want to add anything? No, she's gone.
Sorry, I tried to unmute myself and just took myself out of the
I
conversation.
thought you were like, no, I don't want to add anything.
Yeah, really don't. No, I don't really feel like I have anything. I guess if I was going to say something, I'd probably just be kind of saying what people have said before and then like saying it in my own words. So yeah, just seconding everything that's already been said.
Okay, well, we're almost at time, so I just wanted to thank each and every one of you for giving your time to share your knowledge on this subject, and also to the people that came to listen. There are some unanswered questions. We can hopefully try and get to them on a different webinar. If people want to sign up to the cXc newsletter, please do. We've got many more of these webinars that we'll be hosting with our local partners, and we have great speakers as you've experienced today. So the newsletter link is in the chat, and we've also put through our emails if there are any questions. And I think everyone who's been on the panel has put forward their contact information. And if not, and you want to get in touch with us, please feel free to email us. And we hope to see you very soon on another webinar. So once again, thank you to the panelists, to Preeti, Kate, Elise, and we will see you soon. Many thanks.